Hey knitters, welcome back to my channel. My name is Carrie and this is episode 2.5 of Knitting Fundamentals, the long tail cast on. In this video, we're going to go over things to actually master this cast on and all of its potential. We'll go over troubleshooting tension issues with it, what to do if a stitch falls off after you've cast it on, and how to cast on in pattern, plus some other neat little tips and tricks to make this cast on as useful as possible. Whether you're a new knitter or an experienced knitter, you're going to find tons of useful information in this video to help you become a master of the long tail cast on. If you haven't already watched part 1 of Knitting Fundamentals Long Tail Cast On, I really suggest that you check it out because there's going to be information in that video that will pertain to things that I talk about here. I've got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm just going to jump in. If you'd like to skip around to any part of the video, as always, I do have time code in the description box below. So let's cast on. So right off the bat, let's talk about alternative ways to start your long tail cast on. In the first video, I showed the slip knot technique. The slip knot is a great way to start the long tail cast on, especially if you're a new knitter, because it provides a very stable start. But the downside of using a slip knot is that you do get a little bit of a knot right there at the beginning of your knitting. Now, that may not bother you. However, there is another way to start the long tail cast on, which I think is just a little more elegant, and that's to do the twist start. Here's my tail to my left, my working yarn is to the right. I'm going to take my tail and put it over my thumb. Then I'm going to pick up the yarn to the right and put it over my forefinger. And I'm going to grab the 2 strands of yarn with my back 3 fingers and bloop! I have a nice little triangle. I have the nice little slingshot position. Here is this bar of yarn here, and there's the left side and the right side of that bar. My needle is going to start on the right side of the yarn, and I'm going to, like a high jumper, take my needle and have it jump over to the left side of the yarn, and then it's going to come underneath. Then I'm going to twist my needle away from me, and boom, that's the twist start. It's really not that hard to do. But as usual, I like to break it all down into the smallest components of the motion as possible. But now I'm all set up to cast on. So I just bring my needle down, then I cast off my thumb, and voila. And if you look here, I'm going to bring this up closer. If you look here, there's that twist start. And instead of a little knot there, it just kind of slopes. So it's just a little bit more elegant of a start. I especially like it when I'm knitting something with an exposed edge. For example, a scarf, a blanket, even a square dishcloth. Having that more elegant start to the cast on, it's one of those little details that really just elevates your knitting. But as always, it's dealer's choice which you prefer, whether you like doing the slip knot or the twist start. In part 1 of the video, I did cover how you can estimate a long enough tail to do the cast on without running out of yarn, which is really important. However, there is actually another way that you can do this cast on and never have to worry about having a tail that comes up short for you. And that's actually to use 2 balls of yarn. You can use this method if you just have a lot of stitches to cast on. There are projects that sometimes have 200, 300, 1,000 stitches. I did a project that had 1,000 stitches. You can also use this method if you're wanting to cast on 2 colors at once, which is something you might want to do for double knitting, Fair Isle. There's times that you might want to knit on 2 colors. So I'm going to show you how to do this using 2 separate colors so you can really see what's going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my 2 ends here and I'm going to slip knot the two together. Unlike a standard long tail cast on, this slip knot does not count as a stitch. You will not knit into it. I'm going to leave about a 6-inch tail so I have yarn to weave in with. You always have tails, no matter what. All right. Now I just have to decide which yarn is my tail and which one is my working yarn. In this case, my yellow yarn is going to be my tail, so it's off to my left, and my gray yarn is going to be my working yarn, which will be off to the right. And I can begin casting on. If you want to cast on in one color, you can use 2 balls of yarn, or if you have a center pull ball, you can use the end from both the inside and the outside of that ball of yarn. Once I've casted on all of my stitches, I will break this yarn, that's the tail yarn, the one to my right. I'll break this and I will continue knitting with my working yarn. The only time I'm not going to break this yarn is if I'm going to be knitting with 2 colors, in which case both yarns will stay intact. The one downside to using this technique is if you're breaking this yarn, you're going to have 3 tails to weave in at the end of knitting the project. So that's the downside of this, but you know, every knitting technique has its pros and its cons, and not having to worry about running out of a tail while you're casting on is a pretty big pro. One of the big challenges with long tail cast on is getting good, even tension. Most often, not always, but most often, what knitters will struggle with is having too tight of a cast on. And when you knit too tight of a cast on, what happens is that the bottom pulls in and the rows that you knit above that cast on flare out. Not a great result. Now, it is possible to have the opposite problem, which is to have too loose of a cast on, in which case what will happen is the bottom of the work will flare out as the rest of the knitting narrows. Also, not a great outcome. Tension issues with your long tail cast on is usually caused by the spacing in between the stitches. Let's remember for a second what exactly the long tail cast on is. It's a series of loops that are knitted into, and those loops get too tight. Editing Carrie here. I just want to explain this a little better. So right here I'm about to cast on, and where the tension problem can develop is right here where I'm about to tighten up that loop of yarn. That's where I can tighten up too much, creating too small of a loop. To avoid tightening up on that loop too much, I can create more spacing between the stitches. So how do I properly size the spacing in between the stitches? The perfect tool to do this is easily within hand. Literally in your hand. Literally, it is your hand. Specifically, it's the tip of your finger. Let me demonstrate. I'm going to take my fingertip and I'm going to place it on top of that first stitch, okay? And I'm going to do it so that it roughly lines up to just above my first knuckle. That's where I find works well for me. I cast on my first stitch, but when I go to tighten, I make sure that I tighten so that this stitch stays at my fingertip, all right? And I have a nice gap now between my first stitch and my second stitch. Then I just take my fingertip and I put it on the stitch that I just casted on, again, roughly lining it up with the top of my knuckle. Cast on my third stitch and I tighten down so that the stitch stays around my fingertip. Not only do I create good spacing in between my stitches, the spacing is the same, and these loops of yarn right here are all the same size. So I'm getting a really nice cast on edge where everything is nice and uniform. So really simple solution to a very common problem with the long tail cast on. We have our lovely bit of cast on stitches that have lovely tension to them, and we can start knitting across. Everything should be fine now, except sometimes what can happen is you're knitting and then Oh no, I just dropped one of my cast on stitches. In part one of this video, I went in depth as to what the structure of the long tail cast on is. You know, it's a loop of yarn that you immediately knit into. Now we're going to be able to take that knowledge and apply it to fixing a dropped stitch like this. So what do? Very simple. We're going to use a crochet hook to recreate that loop and then repair the stitch. I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right. So here we have our stitches. Now, the thing with the long tail cast on is it has two distinct sides. So this is the purl bump side. If I turn my needles over here, this is considered the knit side of the work. These slants, those are the loops of yarn that we created with the tail that we knitted into. So we want these slants facing us when we do this repair. And I have here 2 strands of yarn. All right, one of these strands is the tail that I created the loop with, and the other strand is the working yarn that I used to knit a stitch to work into that loop of yarn. So what I need to do to recreate the loop of yarn is identify the tail strand here. And I'm gonna have to put this down for a second. If I look closely and I just take my finger and I run it across those slants right there, I put my finger underneath it, that was the tail that I used to create the loop. So I'm going to use my crochet hook to create a loop of yarn out of this. I'm going to take my crochet hook and I'm going to move it so that the hook side is up and put it underneath that tail yarn. I need to turn this crochet hook counterclockwise to the left so that it matches the slants. So that's the key. You need to turn your crochet hook counterclockwise. All right, I'm going to take my crochet hook and the hook is facing up. I'm going to put it underneath that working strand of yarn. I'm going to pull the crochet hook towards me, grabbing that yarn, and then I'm going to pull it through that loop of yarn, and I've just recreated the cast on stitch. And I can just now take that and put it back on my needle. I can now turn my needles back around and continue knitting. I want to show you really quickly is what it looks like when you've twisted that loop of yarn the incorrect direction, because you will know right away. It will look wrong. So let me show you what that looks like. I'm going to drop another stitch here. Whoop, oh no. Turn my needles around. Sometimes what's hard about this is you've just got a lot of things. It's fiddly doing this. But if you can take your needles, put it down on a flat surface, it actually does help. I'm going to take my crochet hook, and when I twist, this time I'm going to twist clockwise to the right. Grab and pull that stitch through. Put it back on the needle. Look what that looks like this time. It looks like these 2 stitches are both coming out of the same loop of yarn. If you see this, you know you twisted it clockwise instead of counterclockwise. So no big deal, just take it out, do it again. One last thing about this repair, sometimes when you go back to look, you'll see where that drop stitch was, because this slant is going to be a little looser than the stitches around it. What you can do is just take your needle and just kind of pull on the slants to either side of it to kind of take up some of that slack and even out those loops of yarn at the bottom. So, you know, just to make it look a little less noticeable that you did a repair there. And of course, if you're unhappy with the results after that repair, you can always take everything off the needle and start all over again. But I always like to try to repair it with a crochet hook first and save me that trouble. So a lot of times when you learn this cast on, people will talk about that the first row of knits that you do is the wrong side of the work. Let me explain. Here's those loops of yarn, right, that we're working off my thumb, and you have nice little slants. These slants is known as the knit side of the cast on. A lot of people consider this side, which is the knit side that has these little slants, to be the right side of the work or the public side of the work. When I go to knit my first row of a pattern, I'm going to turn my needle, and here, I'm going to bring this up closer so you can really see them, are little purl bumps. So people think of these purl bumps as being the wrong side of the work, and so when you go to do your first row, you are working a wrong side row. But let's say that you want to be able to cast on, turn your needle, and have those slants, those knitted stitches facing you, so the very first row that you knit after your cast on is a right side row. Is there a way of doing that? And the answer, of course, is yes. All right, starts off the exact same way. I'm going to grab the 2 strands of yarn with my back 3 fingers, insert my forefinger and my thumb in between the 2 strands, be in the triangle position, like that, and bring my needle down, and now I have my 4 strands of yarn. Now, before, if you looked, there was a loop of yarn on my thumb, but if you look closely, there's also a loop of yarn on my forefinger, and that's the loop we're going to work into. So I'm going to bring my needle to the right side of my forefinger, insert my needle through that loop. So now it's between strands 3 and 4. I'm going to reach my needle over to the nearest strand, that's strand number 2, wrap the yarn, and pull it through the loop of yarn on my forefinger. And now I have a stitch on my needle, pull my forefinger out, and tighten. Do it again. I'm going to bring my needle to the right side of my forefinger, bring the needle up under strand 4. So now my needle is between strands 3 and 4. I'm going to reach over to strand 2 and leave the needle to the right side of that strand. Bring it underneath. Now the yarn is wrapped over my needle. I'm going to then bring my needle back down through that loop on my forefinger, take my forefinger out, bring it back in between the 2 strands that I'm holding with my back fingers, and tighten. There's these little purl bumps. See if you can see those. Now when I turn my needle to work those stitches, look! All the knit stitches are now facing me. Let's say you're knitting a project and you're starting with 2x2 ribbing. So you knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2. You can actually cast on so that you cast on 2 knit stitches, cast on 2 purl stitches, cast on 2 stitches, cast on 2 purl stitches. And what that allows you to do is to have a cast on that matches your stitch pattern. So that's what casting on in pattern is. So we're casting on pattern 2x2 rib, so I'm going to do 2 knits, 2 purls. So I cast on off my thumb, 1, this, by the way, remember, this counts as a stitch. So that's 1, 2 knits. Now I'm going to knit purls. 1 purl, 2 purl. Now I'm going to cast on knits. So off my thumb, 1 knit, 2 knits. Now I'm doing 2 purls. So I cast off my forefinger, 1 purl, 2 purls. So that's all it is. When you cast off of the loops off your thumb, you're making a knit stitch, and when you cast off knits off your forefinger, then you are creating purl stitches. Boom. And now I have, see, now I have a 2x2 rib started. The nice thing about casting on in pattern is that the elasticity of your cast on will match the elasticity of the stitch pattern. So that's the big advantage of it. That's everything I know about the long tail cast on. There might be more things out there to know about it, and if you know something that I didn't cover, please comment below, share, let us know. You might inspire a 3rd video in this series because there's always something new to learn about knitting. Also, if you have any questions about what I've covered between these two videos, please let me know. I'd really love to answer and help clarify or help out in any way that I can. I love knitting and I love talking about knitting, and I would love to talk about knitting with you. And if you want to talk about knitting in other platforms, I am on various social media. You can find that information in the description box below. If you found this video helpful, please like and share it with your friends. It really does help with the YouTube algorithm, kind of getting my video out there and letting people know that, hey, she's a good YouTuber to follow if you're into knitting. So the next video in the series, we are going to learn how to do the knit stitch. Yes, yes, we're finally going to do it. A lot of people don't feel like they're really learning how to knit until they do those first knit stitches. And if you want to make sure that you don't miss that video or any of my videos, please subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell, which will let you know whenever I upload a new video. I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, whenever you may be watching this. And as always, happy knitting! Woo, boy. I was so proud. I was like, oh gosh, this is going so well. I don't even know what I'm going to use for outtakes. And I did a clip and an video. Spoke too soon. Spoke too soon. Let me tell you, it's been a while since I had to do a repair on a longtail cast on, like when I dropped a stitch. It's been a while, and I first shot it, and it turns out I wasn't shooting. It's a whole long thing, which turned out to be good because I actually had to take a few minutes to remind myself how to twist the yarn properly. I need coffee. Coffee, 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 coffee. Awesome. You're gonna start knitting across. Just wasting memory right now.